You want to make a judgment about someone and determine whether or not they are cool. They will treat you nicely if they want anything from you. James Garner, who had been holding a harsh truth for decades, eventually came out at the age of 85. It had nothing to do with celebrity, wealth, or even Hollywood politics. It was about Doris Day, a woman who was loved by everyone. Even his closest friends were taken aback by what he stated about her. Few couples could light up the silver screen like James Garner and Doris Day did in the early 1960s. In movies like The Thrill of It All and Move Over Darling, audiences were enamored with their witty repartee, flirty banter, and captivating chemistry. Their glitz, charisma, and apparent synchronization made them the ideal couple for light-hearted romantic comedies. However, the reality behind the scenes was much less polished, even though the public loved them together. Some members of the team whispered, even while filming, that the two stars' relationship was not as warm as the final edits indicated. Garner had a reputation for being straightforward, low maintenance, and unimpressed by Hollywood gimmicks. America's sweetheart, however, was Doris Day, a well-planned picture that, in Garner's own words, did not always correspond with her on-camera behavior. Their backgrounds were diverse within the industry. Day, the wholesome movie office darling molded by studios who required her to be flawless at all times, and Garner, the tough TV personality who became a starring guy. In the excitement of it all, their first partnership was a commercial success. Garner would subsequently imply, however, that it was everything but exciting to work with Day. Years later, when asked about her in interviews, he would smile sweetly and provide well-chosen compliments. His own notebooks, however, provided a different account. There were repeated references to what he described as Day's contrived charm, and he made a note of instances on set that annoyed him. She knows how to get what she wants, and she knows when to play innocent. That is the dangerous part. That phrase alone paints a far more nuanced picture than the one Hollywood attempted to sell in press tours and advertising photos. This is one of the most telling entries from the time. Even more telling is the fact that Garner frequently brought up the topic of the day in his writing, as though their collaboration had had a deeper impact on him than he was willing to acknowledge. Constantly conscious of how the public would perceive them, studio management supported the notion that Garner and Day were close friends. To increase ticket sales, they staged lighthearted interviews, posed them together off-set, and capitalized on their connection. It worked for a time. However, Garner's silence on Day became increasingly apparent as the years passed. Garner's name was noticeably missing from the co-stars and directors' reflections on their collaborations. In turn, he hardly ever mentioned her until asked to, and when he did, his compliments were brief and oddly clinical. What specifically went wrong in their relationship? What caused a man who was friendly with almost everyone in Hollywood to become so aloof toward Doris Day? It all started with one day on set, according to people close to him. One moment that would catch Garner off guard and ultimately make him feel deceived. And everything that followed would be influenced by what transpired in that instant. Things took a drastic turn when Move Over Darling was being filmed. Ever the professional, James Garner insisted on performing the majority of his own stunts. He had established a reputation as someone who was prepared to risk everything for a good take, and he felt it gave his performances more sincerity. However, one scene in particular tested that reputation to its breaking point, and revealed a side of Doris Day that he would never forget. Garner had to execute a physical prank in the sequence that included a bathtub, a slick floor, and an awkward fall. It was standard slapstick romantic comedy on paper. It was actually far more deadly than anyone had thought. Garner dislocated his shoulder and tore ligaments when he slipped more forcefully than he meant to and landed awkwardly during the shot. The team hurried in. The cameras stopped. Production stopped. However, it was not the injury itself that stayed with Garner the most. It was the response of Doris Day. Day little moved, according to several set reports. As crew members fumbled about the fallen actor, she stood there aloof and unconcerned. She turned away, according to some. According to others, she only watched with a gaze that Garner would later characterize as aloof. Garner was surprised, but no one knew for certain what she was thinking at the time. He said he was expecting a quick check-in, a sign of care, or something, but it never materialized. Garner described the incident with remarkable clarity later in his autobiography. Pained and unable to move my shoulder, I lay on the floor. And I recalled Doris simply standing there when I looked up. There was no response, no worry, nothing in her eyes. Words could never express how much that told me. More than any gossip column or tabloid story, one sentence demonstrated the extent of the hurt. Years later, Day was questioned about the event in interviews. As usual, she dismissed it with a laugh, claiming that Garner was a tough person. Garner, however, never shrugged it off. He needed physical therapy for months after missing a few days of filming. Eventually, his body's pain subsided. However, he claims that the injury to his pride, and more significantly, to his opinion of Doris Day, never materialized. According to several insiders, she froze in the moment since she was so overwhelmed that day. Others surmise that she was simply trying to get through the day, since she was annoyed by the long hours. But it was something else, something colder, Garner thought. He sensed she didn't view the situation as a crisis, but rather as an annoyance. And there was no turning back once he came to that conclusion. They interacted politely but cautiously after that day. For the cameras, the warmth that viewers trusted was meticulously preserved. However, there was a noticeable gap between them as the director shouted cut. Garner, who had always taken great satisfaction in being a pleasure to deal with, started to distance himself. And even though he never spoke to her directly about it, he remembered that quiet for many years. It marked a sea change in Garner's perspective on Day, as a person as well as in their working relationship. He would subsequently claim that the incident taught him exactly who she was, despite the fact that he never made a big deal out of it or started a contentious interview. And from then on, that belief would inform every choice he made in relation to her. Following the triumph of their initial two collaborations, studios were keen to reunite James Garner and Doris Day. The public adored them. Their combined names virtually assured a hit, and the movie office results confirmed it. However, one eagerly awaited project would never be completed. Additionally, what transpired behind the scenes caused a rift between them that never went away. Production was underway, and Garner had already signed on when it was announced that Doris Day had abruptly left. Garner was caught off guard by the sudden and silent withdrawal, which came with no prior notice or explanation. According to reports, he had pushed Day for the part because he thought their previous connection would help the movie succeed again. There was more to her abrupt departure than a scheduling conflict. It was intimate. According to production insiders, Garner was furious. He was embarrassed that someone he believed he could at least depend on professionally had let him down. In addition, there were reports that Day had signed a secret contract with a different studio for a solo production that conflicted with the one Garner had agreed to. The outcome was the same, whether it was an effort to avoid working with him again or a greater salary. The bag was left in Garner's grasp. He eventually acknowledged that the quiet was what hurt the most. There was no phone call, no apology, no explanation, just a silent departure, as though the movie and his participation were completely pointless. According to his friends, he took the relocation personally and saw it as a clear indication that they no longer wanted to interact with him. Garner allegedly started rejecting scripts with her name on them after that. That was not something he wanted to experience again. None of this was known to the public for years. The press cited creative disputes as the reason for the film's covert cancellation. The fallout, however, was serious behind the scenes. Garner distanced himself even more from Day. Furthermore, although he maintained his grace in public, his private remarks revealed a quite different picture. Decades later, Garner gave a succinct and direct answer when asked if he would ever collaborate with her again. It was enough once. From a man who rarely used absolutes, it was a loaded response. And the moment of no return was marked by that wordless rejection. Doris Day's autobiography, a glossy, best-selling memoir that depicted her life in gentle pastels, was published in 1976. Its sweetness and vulnerability were acclaimed by fans, and for many, it was the closest they had ever been to meeting the genuine Doris. She talked about her difficult marriages, her upbringing, and the demands of celebrity. Although its content was selected, its tone was open. In James Garner's opinion, the book stated more about what it omitted than what it disclosed. Day just made a fleeting reference to Garner in his more over 300 pages, saying a few complimentary things about how great he was to work with. No shared memories, no stories, no indication of their underlying bond or tension from the past. The omission was startling to someone who co-starred with her in two of her most popular movies, and it felt like a purposeful erasure to Garner. In private, he was angry. He had anticipated that the years they spent together on set, the highs and lows, and everything in between, would at least be acknowledged to some extent. Instead, he seemed to have been completely removed from her story. According to those close to him, he felt insulted and even made fun of for the lack of space she gave him. She was now but a footnote to a man who had been instrumental in two of her most famous performances. The book was full of fond memories of other co-stars, which, in Garner's opinion, made it worse. Cary Grant, Rock Hudson, and even a few lesser-known actors who had only collaborated with her once. Garner wasn't simply left out. That very absence was what picked him apart. It was more than what she didn't say. Instead, it was about whom she decided to speak. Garner appreciated honesty, but he wasn't one to seek attention. He thought that, rather than focusing only on the bits that made someone appear good, stories should be conveyed in all their messiness. According to him, Dee's memoir was meticulously chosen, molded to maintain a public persona that left little space for uncomfortable realities. By subtly deleting the passages that did not match her meticulously crafted portrayal, she had, in his opinion, taken charge of the story. In contrast, Garner wrote a chapter on his time working with Day in his own memoirs, which was published years later. It was brutally honest, but not bitter. Although he stated their relationship off-camera was tense, courteous, and primarily professional, he described their on-screen chemistry as genuine. He noted that when they were alone together, he never really understood her, and that something always felt a little off. There was only unresolved tension that hung there, like an unanswered question, not malice. The glaring disparity between their two narratives only served to widen the gap. As her book was being applauded by her supporters, Garner's remarks came as a sudden and unnerving clap. It was perceived by some as a last jab. Others regarded it as a man who, after years of maintaining appearances, was finally speaking the truth. However, it was more than that to those who understood how he had carried that quiet for decades. It was genuine closure, although a little late. And it was obvious to those who could read between the lines. Doris Day, Garner thought, had changed history and excluded him. Furthermore, it was impossible to go back after history had been altered. Silence frequently spoke louder than scandal in vintage Hollywood. Additionally, the silence of their common acquaintances in the instance of James Garner and Doris Day spoke for itself. It was uncommon for directors, producers, and actors who had collaborated with both stars to discuss their relationship. It was more than just a matter of deference. The reason for this was that no one wanted to become involved in something they did not fully comprehend. One of Dee's best friends, Rock Hudson, was especially silent whenever Garner's name was mentioned. He was frequently seen as the link between their two worlds and had worked with both stars. But he never provided an explanation for what went wrong. Only rumors were stoked by that silence. Some others thought Hudson knew more than he disclosed, particularly about off-camera conflicts that were never reported by the tabloids. Others in Day's group did the same. When reminiscing, directors who had worked on her films praised her warmth and charm in glowing remarks, neatly excluding Garner. Garner, who is renowned for his candor, decided to exercise restraint. That was telling enough on its own. His tone changed with Doris, but he would say what he wanted about almost everyone else in Hollywood. Yes, there was frustration, but there was also something more substantial: sadness, perhaps even disappointment. Rumors began to circulate over time. Some conjectured that the conflict between Garner and Day might have stemmed from more than just a lost relationship, a hidden disagreement, a broken promise, or a professional falling out. Even years after they had ceased collaborating, people close to both stars acknowledged that the energy connecting them was complex, though no one could be sure. The manner that Day was still observed in Hollywood was another factor that contributed to the mystery. As one of the last great icons of a bygone period, she received several honors and accolades. Garner never voiced his disapproval in public, but according to sources, he was annoyed by how she seemed to get away with it. According to one of Garner's friends, she could charm the world. However, Jim never recovered from that charm. Day was untouchable in the court of popular opinion. Meanwhile, Garner was burdened by an unsolved past that no one wanted to discuss. He also never let go of the sense that something significant had been left unsaid between them, even though he never attempted to break her down. And until the very end, there would be stillness. James Garner remained a renowned Hollywood figure over the years, quiet in retirement, graceful in aging, and adored by admirers who recalled him as a leading man who never followed the rules. He mostly avoided the limelight, preferring to spend his final years in seclusion. However, Garner finally addressed the one name that had plagued his legacy for decades, at the age of 85, in an interview that few anticipated and even fewer were ready for. Day Doris. It was not intended to be a confessional interview. It started off as a retrospective, a look back at a career filled with legend. However, the interviewer brought up Day almost casually as the topic shifted to the heyday of romantic films. Garner was silent for a moment. He then let out a sigh and spoke in a way that would surprise even his closest friends and family. I never really let her go. It wasn't an angry statement. It was silent, introspective, and almost depressing. According to Garner, forgiveness had never been about the eraser from her memoir, the canceled movie, or even the onset injury. It was a betrayal of trust, something more profound. He claimed that she was aware of what she did, but she never acknowledged it, not even in a phone call or a single word. He acknowledged that he had harbored the bitterness for longer than necessary, and that it had persisted due to disappointment rather than hatred. He said we had an opportunity to be something amazing, perhaps even off it, not just on the screen. But I was never able to find out why she shut that door. The interviewer was caught off guard by the confession. This was not the flaming feud journalists loved to dramatize, nor was it the usual Hollywood resentment. It was something quieter and colder, a wound that had never healed because its perpetrator had never admitted its existence. Fans and other actors were moved by Garner's remarks. Others stood up for Day, arguing that she must have had good reason. Others recognized a lifetime of holding back, and they sympathized with Garner's sense of abandonment. However, the revelation was never intended to spark a conflict. It was just a man as he was dying, speaking the truth as he saw it. Long after the interview was over, his last statement about the subject was still in the air. Occasionally, the most hurtful people are the ones you least expect, and neither of them could have fixed things by then since it was too late. Tributes to Doris Day came in from all across the world after her death in 2019. She was regarded as a shining star, a classic voice, and a symbol of the heyday of Hollywood. Her passing evoked feelings of respect and longing. However, it left an unfinished story that would never be concluded for James Garner, who had died only a few years previously. Despite being quiet, Garner's revelation had illuminated their legacy. Viewers started to review their movies, looking for hints of stress and wondering what had actually transpired behind those amusing grins and well-timed jokes. However, all of the hurt, miscommunication, and animosity that had been between them perished with them. No letter would be found, no apology would be made, and no last-minute reconciliation would take place. The door was permanently shut. Film historians and biographers have attempted to reconstruct what went wrong in the years since. Some people think the conflict stemmed from unacknowledged egos and conflicting personalities, and was professional in nature. The reality is still unknown, but others believe it was something more intimate, perhaps even romantic, and neither star ever wanted to talk about it in public. Garner's following remarks were never addressed by Doris Day. Whether she ever heard them at all is unknown. In her later years, she had become renownedly quiet, rarely speaking in public, and concentrating mostly on her work as an animal advocate. Garner had already disappeared from the public eye by the time she did open up. She never expressed any regrets, if she had any. Thus, the mystery still stands. A legacy as brilliant as it is unfinished was left by two of Hollywood's biggest stars, who will always be connected by two iconic movies and decades of conjecture. They had genuine on-screen chemistry. Nobody questions that. A more eerie tale of lost opportunities, damaged pride, and a stillness that spoke louder than any screenplay is told from the distance behind the curtain. Maybe it was not about blame after all. Maybe it was about two people who were molded by a profession that pushed for false grins, stillness in the face of suffering, and perfection. Millions of people were delighted by what they shared on TV. What they didn't say, however, paints a completely different picture that might never be fully comprehended. Perhaps the most human aspect of all is that